There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, a Tuesday evening that feels like any other, a quiet lull in a conversation that has happened 1,000 times before. They were the camouflage of routine, and only in retrospect do you see them for what they were. The pivot point, the subtle shift in the tectonic plates of your existence. For me, that moment was illuminated by the pale, sterile light of a phone screen in a darkened room. It was the moment a simple request, spoken in a voice thick with sleep, became a demand that was not about a picture, but about possession. It was about closing a distance I had spent years pretending did not exist, a chasm I had meticulously papered over with the flimsy architecture of friendship. He saw the generic, calming image of a misty forest I used as my phone's wallpaper, a landscape of impersonal beauty, and in the quiet dark of my bedroom, his voice was a soft weight, a gentle pressure. He said, "Change it to a picture of me." And then, he watched, his gaze unwavering, until I did. To understand the gravity of that command, the sheer, breathtaking audacity of it, you have to understand the geography of our friendship. You have to know about the lines I had drawn, the borders I had so carefully patrolled for 4 years. Alex and I had met in the way people in their mid-20s often do, through a constellation of mutual acquaintances at a painfully loud house party. I was there as a favor to a friend, tucked into a corner trying to make myself as small as possible, nursing a beer and observing the room through what I like to think of as my photographer's eye, but what was really just a shield of social anxiety. I cataloged the way the cheap party lights caught the condensation on a glass, the burst of laughter from a group by the speakers, the feigned interest in a dozen overlapping conversations. I was an archivist of moments I was not a part of. And then there was Alex. He was the opposite of a corner dweller. He was a center of gravity, pulling people into his orbit with an easy, unforced charisma. He wasn't loud or boisterous, not in the way that demands attention, but he possessed a kind of kinetic warmth that made people want to be near him. He was a consultant, some kind of software wizard who translated complex code into human language for bewildered executives, a job that took him to a different city every other month. He moved through the world with a restless energy, a man who seemed comfortable everywhere and nowhere all at once. That night, he broke away from his circle and drifted into my quiet corner, not with a question or a pickup line, but with a simple, conspiratorial observation. "I think that guy," he'd murmured, nodding toward the host, "has been telling the same story about his trip to Thailand for the last 45 minutes. I've timed him." It was such a simple, dry remark, but it was an invitation. It was a recognition that I, too, was an observer, and it instantly created a bubble around the two of us. We spent the rest of the night in that corner, talking about everything and nothing: bad movies, the questionable structural integrity of the balcony, his job that sounded like a foreign language to me, my photography that sounded like a strange magic to him. He didn't just ask what I photographed, he asked what I saw. He wanted to know how I chose a subject, what I felt when I looked through the lens, how I knew when a moment was the moment. No one had ever asked me that before. People saw the results, the crisp landscapes, the stark architectural shots, the occasional candid portrait, but he was interested in the process, in the invisible machinery behind my eyes. A few months later, through a series of roommate-related misfortunes on his part, he ended up needing a place to stay for what was supposed to be a couple of weeks. My spare bedroom, which mostly served as a storage space for lenses, tripods, and half-finished projects, was empty. The weeks turned into a month, and the month turned into him quietly moving his few belongings from boxes into the closet and drawers. We never had a formal conversation about it. One day he just started paying half the rent, his name appeared on the mailbox, and our apartment became home. Our lives braided together with a startling, organic ease. My quiet, ordered existence was suddenly filled with the low hum of his presence. His running shoes by the door, the scent of his ridiculously expensive coffee brewing in the morning, the sound of his keyboard tapping late into the night as he finished a report for a client in a different time zone. He was the tide, and I was the shore. He would be gone for a week, a whirlwind of flights and hotels and conference rooms, and the apartment would feel hollow, too large, the silence pressing in on me. Then he would return, blowing back in with a suitcase full of laundry and stories of airport delays and terrible room service, and the space would feel right again. it would feel balanced. We built a life in the quiet spaces. We fell into routines that were never discussed, but became as rigid as law. Movie nights on Fridays, him sprawled on one end of the couch and me on the other, a bowl of popcorn between us. Sunday mornings spent in comfortable silence, me editing photos at the dining table, him reading or catching up on emails, the only sounds the click of my mouse and the rustle of a turning page. It was in those quiet, domestic moments that my feelings for him began to develop, like a photograph submerged in a chemical bath. It was a slow, creeping process, an image gradually emerging from the ether. At first, it was just a deep, abiding affection, the kind of profound fondness you feel for someone who sees you and accepts you without question. But then it began to sharpen, to gain color and contrast. I started noticing things with the hyper-focused clarity of my camera lens. The way a stray piece of his dark hair fell across his forehead when he was concentrating. The exact shade of blue in his eyes when he laughed, a color like the deep, clear water of a mountain lake. The small scar just above his eyebrow from a childhood biking accident. I started cataloging these details, storing them away in a secret gallery in my mind. I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and absolute, that I was in love with him. And I knew, with that same certainty, that I could never tell him. Our friendship was a delicate, intricate ecosystem, a perfectly balanced thing that I could not bear to disrupt. Alex dated women. He had a string of girlfriends over the years, relationships that were often intense but short-lived, fizzling out under the strain of his constant travel and his subtle, unnameable restlessness. I was his constant, his port in the storm of his own life. I was the friend he called from lonely hotel rooms, the one who listened to his frustrations, the one who was always there when he came home. To confess my feelings would be to risk that, to potentially shatter the most important relationship in my life. So I buried it. I built a fortress around my heart, and from its highest tower, I watched him, and I waited, though I never knew what I was waiting for. I became an expert in the art of loving from a distance, of translating the inferno inside me into the quiet, steady warmth of platonic affection. It was a masterpiece of self-deception, and for a long time, it was enough. The shift began, as so many shifts do, with an ending. Alex had been dating Sarah for nearly a year, his longest relationship by far. She was smart and funny, and, crucially, she seemed to understand the peculiar rhythm of his life. She didn't seem to mind the travel, the last-minute flights, the long stretches of absence. I thought, with a familiar, dull ache in my chest, that this might be it for him. I had mentally prepared myself for it. For the day he would tell me he was moving out to build a life with her. I had rehearsed the smile I would give him, the words of congratulations I would offer. It was a necessary pain, the cost of being close to him. But it didn't happen. Instead, he came home one Thursday night from a 2-week trip to Chicago, and the moment he walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. The usual energy that surrounded him, that vibrant hum of existence, was gone. It was like a light had been switched off. He dropped his suitcase by the door with a heavy thud that echoed in the sudden silence of the apartment. He didn't offer his usual cheerful greeting or complain about the flight. He just stood there in the entryway, looking lost and hollowed out. "It's over," he said, and his voice was flat, devoid of all its usual warmth. "Sarah and I, it's over." He didn't need to explain the details. I could see them written in the slump of his shoulders, the exhaustion etched around his eyes. He walked past me into the living room and collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. I didn't say anything. I just went to the kitchen, poured him a glass of water, and set it on the coffee table beside him. I sat down in the armchair across from him, a silent sentinel, and let the quiet hold the space for his grief. For hours, he didn't speak. He just sat there, occasionally letting out a long, shuddering breath. The vibrant, confident man I knew had been replaced by this fragile, broken stranger. Late into the night, he finally spoke again, his voice raspy. She said I was never really there. Even when I was home, she said it was like I was just passing through. Like I was living in a waiting room, waiting for the next flight out. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a kind of bewildered pain. "Is that what I'm like, Leo? Am I a ghost in my own life?" I didn't have an answer for him. Or rather, I had too many, and none of them felt right. I saw the truth in her words. I had seen that restlessness in him for years, that sense that he was always looking for something just beyond the horizon. But I also saw the profound loneliness that fueled it, the fear of standing still for too long. Instead of trying to find the right words, I just shook my head. "You're here now," I said softly. It was all I could offer, but in that moment, it seemed to be what he needed. He nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. He didn't try to hide it. That night, the carefully constructed boundary between us, the one that had defined the physical and emotional space of our friendship, began to dissolve. He was too tired, too broken, to maintain it, and I was too worried about him to reinforce it. The fortress I had built around my heart suddenly seemed less like a defense and more like a prison. He was hurting, and my only instinct was to offer him shelter. I just didn't realize that in doing so, I was opening the gates for him to take shelter inside of me. The weeks that followed the breakup were a slow, quiet unraveling. Alex moved through our apartment like a man in a fog. The restless energy that had always defined him was replaced by a heavy, weary stillness. He canceled his next work trip, telling his company he needed to use some personal time, an act so out of character it felt like a seismic event. He spent his days on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the television without really seeing it. He barely ate. He barely spoke. My role shifted from friend and roommate to something more akin to a caretaker. I would make him food and leave it on the coffee table, not pushing him to eat, but just making it available. I would put on movies we both loved, familiar stories that required no emotional investment, and sit with him in the dim light of the living room, my presence a quiet anchor in the storm of his grief. The first time the ritual began, it was almost by accident. We were watching an old black and white film, the kind I loved, and he usually tolerated with good-natured ribbing. He had been silent for hours, his head resting against the arm of the couch. At some point, I glanced over and saw that his eyes were closed, his breathing deep and even. He had fallen asleep. The tension had finally drained from his face, leaving him looking younger, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. The remote was still clutched loosely in his hand. I very carefully, very slowly, reached over and slipped it from his fingers. My heart was hammering in my chest, a frantic bird beating against my ribs. My proximity to him felt electric, dangerous. I grabbed the thick wool blanket from the back of the armchair and gently draped it over him. My fingers brushed against his shoulder, and the brief contact sent a jolt through my entire body. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. I retreated to my side of the couch, my own breathing shallow, and watched him sleep for a long time before finally going to my own bed. This became our new normal. Nearly every night, he would fall asleep on the couch during a movie, and every night, I would perform the small, tender ritual of covering him with the blanket. It was a gesture that existed in a strange, ambiguous space. It was something a friend would do, a simple act of care. But for me, it was freighted with all the unspoken feelings I had kept locked away for years. Each time I leaned over him, I was enveloped by his scent, a faint mix of his shampoo, the laundry detergent we shared, and something that was uniquely, indefinably him. I would allow myself that one moment of unguarded proximity, that one breath of air that was more his than mine, before retreating back to the safety of my own space. It was a form of exquisite torture, a tiny sip of water for a man dying of thirst. Then, one night, the ritual escalated. A storm was raging outside, the wind howling and rattling the window panes. A loud clap of thunder shook the entire apartment building, and Alex, who had been asleep on the couch, jolted awake with a gasp. He sat up, his eyes wide and unfocused, his breathing ragged. "Hey," I said softly from the armchair. "It's just thunder. You're okay." He looked around the darkened room, disoriented. "Bad dream," he mumbled, running a hand through his already messy hair. He looked small and lost. He stayed sitting up, hugging his knees to his chest, long after the storm had moved on. The movie had ended, and the only light came from the dim glow of the streetlights outside. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. "I don't want to be alone," he whispered, and the words were so quiet I almost wasn't sure I'd heard them. He didn't look at me when he said it. He just stared at the blank television screen. My entire body went rigid. Every alarm bell in my carefully constructed defense system started blaring. This was new territory, a landscape for which I had no map. My mind raced through a dozen possible responses, a dozen ways to gently redirect, to maintain the necessary distance. But then I looked at him, at the genuine fear and loneliness in his posture, and all my strategic thinking evaporated. "Okay," I heard myself say. The word felt foreign in my own mouth. I stood up and walked toward my bedroom, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. I left the door open, a silent invitation. I didn't know what I was offering, what I was expecting. I just knew he had asked for something, and I was incapable of refusing him. I got into my bed, pulling the covers up to my chest, and waited, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the silence. A few moments later, his silhouette appeared in the doorway. He hesitated for a long second, a dark shape against the faint light of the hallway. Then, he walked over to the other side of the bed and slid under the covers. He kept a careful, deliberate distance between us, his back turned to me. The space he occupied felt like a brand on the mattress. The bed, my most private sanctuary, was no longer just mine. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear the soft sound of his breathing. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, rigid and sleepless, listening to the sound of him slowly relaxing into sleep beside me. This was no longer a simple gesture of friendship. This was a transgression. We had crossed a line, and I had no idea how to get back. The worst part was, I wasn't sure I wanted to. That night established a new, unspoken rule. The ritual of him sleeping in my bed became as routine as the one on the couch had been. It wasn't every night, but it was most of them. He would never ask directly. There would just be a point in the evening when he would grow quiet, his gaze distant, and I would know. I would get up, say a soft, "good night," and leave my bedroom door ajar. It became a symbol, a silent question and answer. The open door meant, "You are welcome here. You are not alone." And a few minutes later, I would feel the dip in the mattress as he slipped into bed beside me. I learned the cartography of his sleep. I learned that he sometimes mumbled names I didn't recognize. I learned that he kicked the covers off when he got too warm and that he always curled onto his right side, facing away from me. That space he maintained between us was a constant, a physical manifestation of the unspoken rule. We were sharing a space, but not sharing intimacy. It was a refuge born of necessity, a platonic arrangement to soothe his loneliness. I told myself this over and over, a mantra to keep my own heart in check. But it was a losing battle. Having him so close, night after night, was dismantling my defenses brick by brick. My love for him, which I had kept contained for so long, was beginning to seep through the cracks. It was in the way I found myself holding my breath, listening for the sound of his. It was in the irrational urge to reach across the divide and smooth the hair from his forehead. It was in the profound, aching tenderness I felt watching him sleep, the fierce, protective instinct that rose up in me. I was a landscape photographer who had suddenly become obsessed with a single, human subject. I studied the lines of his back, the curve of his shoulder, the shape of his hand resting on the pillow. I was documenting him in the darkness, creating a secret archive of these stolen moments of proximity. The apartment, once a shared space of easy friendship, now felt charged with a new, volatile energy. The air in my bedroom was thick with unspoken things. During the day, we would try to pretend nothing had changed. We would talk about groceries and bills and what to watch on television that night. We would fall back into our old, comfortable patterns. But it was a performance. We were both acutely aware of the open door, of the sanctuary my room had become, and of the invisible line we were walking. It was a delicate, dangerous dance, and I was terrified of making a wrong move. Section. My photography became my only outlet. I would go out for hours with my camera, losing myself in the city. I tried to focus on my usual subjects, the stark geometry of buildings, the play of light on water, the anonymity of a crowded street. But his image was superimposed on everything I saw. I started taking pictures of empty spaces that reminded me of him. A single coffee cup left on a cafe table, an unmade bed in a furniture store window, the indentation left on a park bench after someone had gone. My art was becoming a reflection of my yearning. My portfolio was transforming into a collection of images about presence and absence, about the shape someone leaves in the world when they are and are not there. One afternoon, I was editing photos at the dining table. Alex was on the couch, laptop balanced on his knees, ostensibly working. But I could feel his gaze on me. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the pixels on my screen, on adjusting the contrast and saturation of a sunset over the river. But his attention was a physical weight. Finally, I looked up. He wasn't looking at his screen. He was just watching me, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He closed his laptop and set it on the coffee table. "I was just thinking," he said slowly. "I've seen hundreds of your photos. Landscapes, buildings, strangers. But you've never taken a picture of me." The statement hung in the air between us. It was true. I had thousands of images of him in my mind. A secret, perfect collection. But I had never once turned my professional lens on him. It felt too intimate, too revealing. To capture him on film would be to admit how closely I watched him, to give a physical form to my obsession. It felt like a confession I wasn't ready to make. "I'm not really a portrait photographer," I deflected, turning back to my screen. My hands felt clumsy on the keyboard. "You could be," he said, his voice soft but persistent. "If you wanted to." I didn't answer. The conversation was veering into dangerous territory. He was pushing at the boundaries, testing the walls I had so carefully maintained. I pretended to be absorbed in my work, but I was hyper-aware of his every movement. After a few minutes of tense silence, he stood up and walked over to the table, coming to stand behind me. He leaned over my shoulder to look at my screen, his chin hovering just inches from my temple. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I could feel the warmth of his body, smell the clean, familiar scent of his skin. It was the closest we had been to each other outside the ambiguous darkness of my bedroom. "That's beautiful," he said, his voice a low murmur next to my ear. He was talking about the photograph, a swirl of orange and purple clouds above the dark silhouette of the city. But his proximity made the simple compliment feel like something else entirely. It felt like a caress. He lingered there for a moment too long, his presence a heavy, intoxicating weight. Then, just as suddenly, he straightened up and walked back to the couch, leaving me trembling in the wake of his closeness. The open door to my bedroom was no longer the only ambiguous space between us. The very air in our apartment was becoming thick with questions that neither of us dared to ask aloud. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was electric. The tension that had been building for weeks finally reached its breaking point on an unremarkable Monday night. It was late, well past midnight. We were in my bed, lying in our usual positions, back to back, a carefully maintained trench of empty space between us. I was wide awake, as I often was, staring into the darkness and listening to the rhythm of his breathing. I had become an insomniac, my mind too busy cataloging the infinite nuances of our strange new reality to allow me the mercy of sleep. I was tracing the patterns the moonlight made on my wall, trying to empty my head of everything but the abstract shapes, when he shifted beside me. He rolled over, the movement slow and deliberate, until he was facing my back. I felt the heat of him, closer than ever before. My entire body tensed, every muscle coiled tight. I kept my own breathing even, feigning sleep, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I waited for him to settle, to retreat back to his side of the bed. But he didn't. He moved closer, inch by agonizing inch, until his chest was just barely brushing against my back. And then, he laid his arm over my side, his hand resting gently on my waist. The touch was electric. It was a brand, a claim. It shattered the unspoken rule we had so carefully observed for weeks. This was not the accidental brush of a hand while reaching for popcorn on the couch. This was not the ambiguous comfort of sharing a bed. This was a conscious, deliberate act of intimacy. I lay there, completely still, every nerve ending screaming. I felt like I was made of glass, that the slightest movement would shatter me into a million pieces. His fingers were relaxed against my shirt, but I could feel the weight of them, the warmth of them, seeping through the fabric and into my very soul. My mind was a maelstrom of panic and elation. What did this mean? Was he asleep? Was this an unconscious gesture, a dream-fueled movement that meant nothing? Or was he awake, as I was, lying in the darkness and intentionally closing the distance between us? I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. I just let the moment exist, suspended in time, fragile and terrifying and more beautiful than anything I had ever known. After what felt like a lifetime, his breathing deepened, settling into the slow, even rhythm of genuine sleep. His hand remained on my waist, a steady, warm anchor. And for the first time in weeks, surrounded by the reality of his touch, I finally slept. That night broke the dam. The physical barrier between us was gone, and in its place, a new, tentative language of touch began to emerge. The next night, he didn't wait until I was pretending to be asleep. As soon as we were both settled in bed, he rolled toward me and draped his arm over my waist, pulling me back against his chest. He pressed his face into the space between my shoulder blades, and I felt his soft exhale against my neck. I instinctively relaxed into his hold, my body melting against his. It felt like coming home to a place I had never been before. It felt like an answer to a question I had been afraid to ask for 4 years. Our nights transformed. The bed was no longer a space divided by an invisible wall, but a shared sanctuary. We became intertwined, our limbs tangled together in the darkness. We slept pressed close, his arm a constant, reassuring weight around me, his legs tangled with mine. And yet, during the day, we remained in our strange limbo. We never spoke of it. We never acknowledged the radical shift in our relationship that occurred every night the moment the bedroom door closed. We would wake up in each other's arms, and then we would carefully untangle ourselves and go about our morning routine as if nothing had happened. We were living two separate lives in the same space. The platonic roommates who shared coffee in the morning, and the two people who held each other through the night as if they were drowning. The silence was becoming unbearable. It was a living thing, a third presence in our apartment, growing larger and more oppressive every day. The lack of acknowledgement felt more intimate, more terrifying than the touching itself. It was a secret we were keeping together, a fragile bubble of intimacy that felt like it could be popped by a single, clumsy word. I was drowning in the ambiguity. I needed to know what this was, what he felt, what he wanted. But I was terrified that giving it a name would destroy it, that forcing him to confront it would make him retreat, and I would lose not only this newfound, breathtaking intimacy, but the friendship that had been the bedrock of my life for years. So I stayed silent, and I let him lead our strange, nocturnal dance. And then came the night of the wallpaper. We were lying in bed, side by side, bathed in the cool blue light of our phones. It was one of those rare moments of daytime normalcy extending into our nighttime space. He was scrolling through some news feed, and I was looking up details for a photo shoot I had the next day. The silence was comfortable, easy. For a moment, it felt like we had found a way to merge our two worlds. He laughed at something on his screen and turned to show me a ridiculous video. As he leaned over, his gaze fell on my phone, which I had just set down on the nightstand. My screen was still lit, displaying the image I'd had as my wallpaper for years, a serene, impersonal photograph I had taken of a foggy forest in the early morning. It was beautiful, technically perfect, and completely devoid of personal meaning. It was a safe choice. He looked at the image for a long moment. Then he looked at me. His expression was serious, his eyes searching mine in the dim light. "Change it," he said. His voice was quiet, but it held a strange intensity. I was confused. "Change what?" "Your wallpaper," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "Change it to a picture of me." The request, the command, hung in the air between us, heavy and shocking. It was the most direct thing he had ever said, the first time he had explicitly laid claim to a piece of my life outside the darkness of our bed. My heart began to pound. This was not a joke. There was no trace of his usual easygoing humor in his tone. This was a test. It was a demand for proof, for a public acknowledgement of the secret we had been keeping. I stared at him, my mind blank with shock. I didn't know how to respond. He didn't look away. He just held my gaze, his expression unwavering. And then he added the words that turned it from a request into an ultimatum. "And I want to watch you do it." My breath hitched. He was forcing my hand. He was tired of the silence, of the ambiguity. He was demanding that I make a choice, that I step out from behind the safety of my unspoken feelings and do something real, something tangible. I slowly picked up my phone, my fingers trembling slightly. My thumb hovered over the screen. This felt more significant than any kiss, more intimate than any touch. This was a permanent declaration, an image that would greet me every time I opened my phone, a constant reminder of him. It was an act of surrender. I unlocked the phone and navigated to my photo gallery. My finger hesitated over the icon. My gallery was my most private space, a visual diary of my life. It was filled with thousands of landscapes, architectural details, and street scenes. And hidden among them, like secret jewels, were the photos I had taken of him over the years. Not posed portraits, but candid moments, stolen when he wasn't looking. Alex reading on the couch, the afternoon light catching the dust motes dancing around him. Alex laughing at something on his laptop, his head thrown back in genuine joy. Alex standing on our balcony, looking out at the city skyline, a pensive, thoughtful expression on his face. These were my private treasures, images I had captured for no one but myself. I opened the gallery. I could feel his eyes on me, on the screen. He leaned closer, his head next to mine, his breath warm on my cheek. I began to scroll, my own secret history parading across the screen. Each photo of him that appeared felt like a confession. I could feel my face flushing with heat. He was seeing, for the first time, the evidence of my long-standing adoration. He was seeing the way I saw him. He didn't say a word. He just watched, his breathing steady beside me. I scrolled past dozens of images, my mind racing. Which one? Which version of him did he want me to choose? Which photo would say the right thing? Finally, I stopped on one I had taken a few months ago, before the breakup, before everything had changed. We had gone for a hike, and he had climbed ahead of me up a steep trail. He had turned back to see if I was keeping up, a wide, effortless smile on his face, the sun filtering through the trees behind him, creating a halo effect around his head. He looked happy and free, and so incredibly beautiful it had made my chest ache. It was my favorite picture of him. It was the Alex I had first fallen in love with. With a shaky finger, I selected the photo. I tapped the button to set it as my wallpaper. The phone's interface asked me to confirm. I looked at Alex. His eyes were fixed on the screen, his expression intense. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. I took a deep breath and confirmed the choice. The image of his smiling face filled my screen. It was done. I had done what he asked. I had replaced the safe, impersonal landscape with him. I had put him at the center of my world, right there in glowing pixels for anyone to see. I slowly locked my phone and placed it back on the nightstand, the new image facing up, a small, bright beacon in the dark. The silence that followed was different. It was not the tense, questioning silence of the past weeks. It was a silence of completion, of arrival. I turned my head to look at him. He was already looking at me, his face just inches from mine. The intensity in his eyes had softened, replaced by a look of profound, heart-stopping vulnerability. It was the look of a man who had taken a great risk and was waiting to see if he was safe. "Okay," he whispered, and the single word was filled with a universe of meaning. "Did I do the right thing? Are you okay with this? Are we okay?" I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. All the carefully constructed walls, all the years of self-denial and fear, had crumbled to dust. There was nothing left to hide behind. So I just nodded, a small, shaky movement. And then I closed the final inch of distance between us and kissed him. It was not a passionate, desperate kiss. It was soft and tentative and unbearably gentle. It was a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of relief, of years of unspoken yearning finally given a voice. His lips were softer than I had imagined. He responded instantly, his hand coming up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me there as if he was afraid I might disappear. It was a kiss of discovery, of two people finally learning the language of each other after years of speaking in code. When we finally broke apart, we just rested our foreheads together, breathing the same air. The pale light from my phone screen illuminated his face on the nightstand, a silent, smiling witness. The door I had kept locked for so long was finally, irrevocably, open, and we were both on the same side of it. The morning after was terrifying. I woke up first, just as the gray light of dawn was beginning to seep into the room. Alex was still asleep, his arm thrown possessively over my chest, his face peaceful. For a moment, I allowed myself to just exist in the quiet perfection of it. The man I loved was asleep in my arms. My phone was on the nightstand, his face a declaration of our new reality. It was everything I had ever wanted. And yet, a cold knot of fear was tightening in my stomach. Last night had been a dream, a feverish, emotional breakthrough in the safety of darkness. But morning was here. The real world was waiting. and I had no idea if what we had done could survive in the harsh light of day. I carefully slipped out of his hold, my movements slow and cautious so as not to wake him. I went into the living room, the apartment feeling strangely foreign. Everything looked the same. The couch, the coffee table, my camera bag by the door, but the context had been fundamentally altered. I made coffee, the familiar ritual, a flimsy anchor in a sea of uncertainty. I sat at the dining table, staring at my laptop, but the screen was just a blur. My mind was replaying every moment of the previous night. The demand, the scrolling through the photos, the kiss. It had all felt so right, so inevitable. But what if, for him, it was just a moment of post-breakup confusion, a desperate grasp for comfort that he would regret in the morning? When he finally emerged from the bedroom about an hour later, my anxiety was a physical thing, a sickness in the pit of my stomach. He was wearing his sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair a mess from sleep. He didn't look at me. He walked straight to the coffee maker and poured himself a mug, his back to me. The silence was deafening. It was not the charged, expectant silence of the past weeks. It was a cold, empty silence. A silence of regret. My heart sank. I had been a fool. I had misinterpreted everything. I had let my own desperate hope color my perception of his actions. He had been lonely and grieving, and I had been a convenient source of comfort. The intimacy, the cuddling, the kiss, it was all a product of his vulnerability, not of genuine feeling for me. He was regretting it now. He was embarrassed. He was going to pull away, and I was going to lose him completely. "Alex," I said, and my voice came out as a weak croak. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, staring down into his coffee mug. "I have to go," he said, his voice flat. "I have to. I have a call. A work thing." "You canceled all your work things," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This one is important," he muttered. He took a quick sip of his coffee, then moved toward his own bedroom, the one that had been mostly unused for weeks. He still wouldn't look at me. He closed the door behind him with a soft, final click. And just like that, the wall was back up, higher and thicker than ever before. I sat at the table, my own coffee growing cold, and felt a despair so profound it was difficult to breathe. I had crossed the line. I had allowed myself to believe in a fantasy, and now I was paying the price. The beautiful, honest silence we had shared last night had been replaced by this new, horrifying one. The silence of an ending. For the next 2 days, we were strangers living in the same house. He spent most of his time in his room, the door firmly closed. When he did emerge, for food or to use the bathroom, he avoided my gaze. He was polite, distant. He spoke in monosyllables. The warmth between us was gone, replaced by a frigid, awkward tension. The nights were the worst. I lay alone in my bed, the space beside me a cold, aching void. I stared at the closed door of my bedroom, a symbol of my own foolishness. I had left it open for him, and he had come in, and now he had left, closing it behind him on his way out. Several times, I picked up my phone to change the wallpaper back to the anonymous forest to erase the evidence of my mistake. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. His smiling face on my screen was a cruel reminder of what I had briefly thought I had, and a part of me, the stupid, stubborn, hopeful part, refused to let it go. On the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was going to drive me mad. I was losing him. I could feel him slipping away, and I couldn't let it happen without at least trying to understand why. I had to know if I had imagined everything. I had to hear it from him. I waited until evening, until the sun had set and the apartment was filled with the soft, forgiving light of the lamps. I knocked on his bedroom door. There was a long pause. "Yeah," his voice came muffled. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. Another pause. I could hear him moving around inside. Then, the door opened. He stood there, looking exhausted. His eyes were red-rimmed, as if he hadn't been sleeping. "What is it, Leo?" he asked, his tone weary. I took a deep breath. "What happened, Alex? What changed? 3 nights ago, I thought we finally found something. And now you won't even look at me. If I did something wrong, if I misread everything, just tell me. Please. This silence is killing me." He looked away, his jaw tight. He ran a hand over his face. "It's not you," he said, his voice low. "It's me. I'm a mess. Talk to me." I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Don't shut me out. Not after everything." He finally met my eyes, and what I saw there was not annoyance or regret, but pure, unadulterated fear. I don't know how, he whispered. I don't know what any of this is. Everything with Sarah, she was right. I'm a ghost. I float through things. I don't know how to stay. And what we did, what I asked you to do, that felt real. It felt permanent. And it terrified me. His confession hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't that he didn't feel anything for me. It was that he did. And the reality of those feelings, the weight of them, was too much for him. He was so used to his transient life, to relationships that had built-in expiration dates because of his job, that the idea of something solid, something he couldn't just fly away from, was overwhelming. So you're just going to run away? I asked, a surge of frustration cutting through my despair. You're going to hide in your room and pretend it never happened? After you asked me to put my heart on display on my damn phone screen? You don't get to do that, Alex. You don't get to start this and then just disappear. He flinched as if I had struck him. I'm not running away, he said, though his posture screamed otherwise. It looks a lot like running from where I'm standing. I shot back, my voice rising. You asked for comfort, and I gave it to you. You asked for my bed, and I gave it to you. You asked for a place on my phone, for a place in my life, and I gave it to you. And now you're throwing it all back in my face because you're scared? We're all scared, Alex. But you don't get to make me a casualty of your fear. Tears welled in his eyes. He looked utterly broken. I don't know what I'm doing, Leo, he choked out. For years, you've been the one thing in my life that made sense. The one stable, solid thing. My best friend. And I think I'm in love with you. And the thought of screwing that up, of losing you because I don't know how to do this, how to be this person, it's the most terrifying thing I've ever felt. There it was. The words I had dreamed of hearing for 4 years, spoken in a voice ragged with pain and fear. The dam of my own frustration broke, and all the anger washed away, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy. He wasn't pushing me away because he didn't care. He was pushing me away because he cared too much. He was trying to protect our friendship, the only way he knew how, by retreating to the safety of distance. I stepped forward, closing the space between us. I reached out and gently took his hand. His fingers were cold. You don't have to know how to do this, I said softly, my voice now gentle. We can figure it out together. You have to be willing to stay. You have to stop running. He looked down at our joined hands, and then back up at me, a glimmer of hope in his tear-filled eyes. I'm tired of running, he whispered. Then don't, I said. Stay here, with me. He gave a small, shaky nod, and then he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in my shoulder. I held him tightly, my own tears starting to fall. We stood there in the hallway for a long time, just holding on to each other, two scared, broken people finally choosing to be scared and broken together. The cold, empty silence had been filled, not with noise, but with the profound, healing quiet of mutual understanding. The conflict was over. The real work, the work of building something new and real in the light of day, was just beginning. In the aftermath of that confrontation, something settled between us. The fear and uncertainty didn't vanish overnight, but they were no longer the dominant forces in our apartment. They were replaced by a quiet, deliberate intentionality. We started talking, really talking, not just about movies and groceries, but about our fears, our hopes, and what this new, undefined thing between us was. We sat on the couch for hours, not as roommates on opposite ends, but side by side, our knees brushing, unraveling years of unspoken thoughts. He told me about the deep-seated loneliness that his constant travel both caused and masked. He confessed that he had been drawn to my stillness, my quiet centeredness, from the day we met, because it was everything he felt he lacked. I, in turn, told him about the fortress I had built around my feelings for him, about the years I had spent loving him in secret, terrified of disrupting the perfect, fragile balance of our friendship. I admitted that every time he came home from a trip, it felt like the sun coming out from behind the clouds. I showed him the candid photos I had taken of him, the secret gallery of my affection. He looked through them with a sense of wonder, as if seeing himself for the first time through my eyes. It was a slow, painstaking process of revealing ourselves to each other, of dismantling the walls we had both built. We were learning a new kind of intimacy, one that was not confined to the darkness but could thrive in the bright, honest light of day. The physical geography of our apartment changed again. His bedroom door remained open, but he no longer slept there. My room became our room. There was no more pretext, no more ambiguity. He slept in my bed because he wanted to be with me. We didn't just cuddle for comfort against nightmares. We held each other because it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The space between us was no longer a trench of uncertainty, but a bridge of shared affection. We learned each other's waking rhythms, as well as we knew each other's sleeping ones. He learned that I needed quiet and coffee before I could face the world. I learned that he was most creative in the late hours of the night, his mind buzzing with ideas. The wallpaper on my phone remained. It was no longer a symbol of a test or a demand, but a quiet, constant affirmation. Sometimes I would catch him looking at my phone when it was on the table, a small, soft smile playing on his lips. It was a reminder of the night everything changed, the night he got tired of living in the gray areas and demanded we step into the light. It was our foundation stone. One Saturday morning, a few weeks into our new reality, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I opened my eyes and saw Alex standing by the window, a mug in his hand, looking out at the city. The morning sun streamed in, illuminating his profile. He looked peaceful, grounded. He looked like he was finally home. He turned and saw that I was awake, and his face broke into that wide, effortless smile, the same one from the picture on my phone. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and easy. He walked over and sat on the edge of the bed, handing me a mug of coffee. I took it, our fingers brushing. It was a simple, domestic moment, the kind of ordinary scene that plays out in countless homes every day. But for us, it felt like a miracle. It was a quiet, stable peace we had fought so hard to find. It was the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, a silence that wasn't empty, but full. Full of understanding, full of acceptance, and full of a love that had finally, after so long in the dark, found its voice and its home. We discovered that building a relationship was a lot like developing a photograph. It required patience. It required a willingness to sit in the dark, waiting for the image to emerge. It required just the right amount of exposure, the courage to let the light in without overwhelming the delicate chemistry of what was being created. There were moments of fear, of thinking we had gotten the timing wrong, that the image would be lost forever in the darkness. But we held on. We learned to trust the process. We learned that some of the most beautiful things in life are created slowly, quietly, in a space built not of walls and a roof, but of unwavering trust and the courage to leave the door open. And in the end, the image that emerged, the picture of us, was clearer and more vibrant than anything I could have ever captured with a camera. It was a masterpiece we were creating together, one quiet, ordinary, miraculous day at a time.